Alright, what's going on, guys? Lately, I've been thinking a lot about Souls-like games. It's been the primary genre I've played over the last year, and when I say Souls-like, I specifically mean the games that try to replicate the Dark Souls formula, but are not made by FromSoftware, and they come in many different forms. But the core of the gameplay loop and the overarching game design remain consistent, at least for the most part, because there have been some genuinely fantastic Souls-likes that stand on a similar level to what FromSoftware created, as well as others that didn't quite reach the mark. But today I want to talk about Souls-likes coming out in the future and highlight 5 points that future Souls-likes need to keep in mind, because inevitably after the breakout success of Elden Ring, there are going to be those that try to replicate it. Now these points today are going to be entirely my opinion, but I hope that Souls-like developers will take some of these, because I know many other Souls players feel the same way. So as we get into it today, if you enjoy all things Souls and Souls-likes, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and now let's begin. My first point and suggestion today is to stop trying to do everything. It feels like every single Souls-like that's come out over the past year has tried to be a combination of Bloodborne, Sekiro, and Dark Souls 3 all at once. They've all got the Bloodborne and Sekiro sidestep and the perfect deflect from Sekiro, with the Bloodborne rally system to get your health back, and then throw in some other major feature from a game that was popular 3 years ago. And while games like Lies of P and Lords of the Fallen were able to make this work for the most part, there's been a major plague on recent Souls-likes where there's no one identity to the combat. Elden Ring, for example, opted to innovate in other ways, such as an open world and spirit summoning mechanic, and because of those major innovations, it took the combat back to what we used to know, refining the simple roll from the Dark Souls trilogy and ditching the rally system and perfect block. So by perfecting that core and making it simplistic, it inadvertently made all the new systems work well. The player wouldn't get overwhelmed by unnecessary complexity, and they could focus on the moments in the game that FromSoftware wanted to shine. The reason those combat mechanics worked back then was because they were the core. Everything in Bloodborne was centered around the high-octane combat and close range in order for the player to maximize that rally mechanic. Everything in Sekiro was built around the deflect system, and therefore it worked. So future Souls-likes need to stop trying to reinvent the wheel, and instead focus on refining one thing to perfection and making that the core loop of the game. Except that you can't do everything, but take the things you can and make them perfect. The second point today is to get creative with your setting. Recently, I've been playing a new indie Souls-like coming out later this year called Codex Lost. And while I'm still far from completing that game, I've been blown away by the setting and aesthetic. You play as a mage adventuring through this retro fantasy world, seeking out these sacred and lost grimoires. The world is bright and very colorful, full of life, and bustling with personality, and it feels like a breath of fresh air to me among the market of Souls-likes over the past few years. And I think one of the main contributors to a stagnant theme among Souls-likes was the lasting artistic legacy of Bloodborne. Bloodborne absolutely nailed that gothic and weird style, with an eldritch horror theme. But ever since then, the Souls-like market has been majorly dominated by gothic horrors. Every world is dead, most bosses are macabre abominations, and it's time for a shift. Now there's nothing wrong with gothic horror, and there's a reason it worked, because it's cool, and some people will never get tired of it. But it presents a new opportunity for Souls-likes to stand out, such as Black Myth Wukong, which has a backdrop of Chinese legend. In Ultra, the last song is garnering attention because of its twist on Italian folklore. Personally, I would love to see something with the same vibe as Remnant 2, but with a much more traditional Souls-style gameplay. A great example of the room here is Lies of P, how it took the Pinocchio fairy tale, a story that everybody knows, and twisted it into something special. Now yes, it did heavily rely on Bloodborne inspiration, but it had enough of a Renaissance theme to make up for that. And I do hope that in future games they go away from that a little bit, because there's so much more out there to explore than another dead gothic world. The next thing I want to talk about is meaningful difficulty, because Souls-likes walk a very fine line here. You have a game like Lords of the Fallen, which was heavily criticized for being too easy and lost the meaning of struggle in that regard, while Lies of P, for example, had notoriously hard bosses that would take multiple hours of direct memorization to beat. And the ideal balance is not clearly stated. FromSoftware games have always been given the motto of hard but fair, and a lot of that comes down to player skill being the primary factor that determines winning the fight. There shouldn't be any cheap cop-out ways to win, although even Elden Ring and Sekiro suffer from that a little bit, and there shouldn't be scenarios where you don't have control of your character while a boss can still kill you. You may have heard the phrase artificial difficulty, and this term gets thrown around a lot in context of things like bosses being overtuned in terms of health or damage, environmental factors that limit the player's ability ability to fight the boss, overly long combos that can chain the player into an instant kill. These are all things that disrupt the flow and dance that make a good boss fight feel good. And none of these things individually are bad per se. They all have their uses and can be implemented into a good boss fight, as long as that boss fight is representing a pinnacle in the game that is supposed to be extremely difficult. For example, Malenia has many aspects that people would consider artificial difficulty, such as a massive health pool, Scarlet Rot affliction, and the infamous waterfowl dance. But her entire purpose in the game is to be that biggest challenge, the very final showdown once you reach the end of the game. A good Souls-like has a mix of easy fights and very hard fights, with the majority falling somewhere in between those. But the most important part is that those fights hit the right notes at the right time in your game. After all, as Miyazaki said, the purpose here isn't to make a hard game, but a satisfying game. The fourth point I want to emphasize today is to trust the player. But like the difficulty discussion, it's not so black and white. One of the best tutorial levels of all time is the Undead Asylum. It's full of tutorial messages that teach you the basic controls. They're bright orange all over the ground and nearly impossible to miss. But the key here is that they're optional to read. At no point does the game take away your control of your character, or force you into certain actions in a menu that you can't escape from. But what makes this level so effective into introducing the player into the Dark Souls world is that until you figure out the fundamentals, you won't be able to leave the asylum. You have to go pick up your equipment, learn how to navigate the menu in order to equip it, learn how to use that equipment in order to kill basic enemies that you more than likely won't simply run past, get your Estus flask and learn how to use it after getting hit by a boulder that you won't know exists unless you've played the game before, and then use everything you've learned up to that point to kill a boss before finally being able to leave the asylum. It's an unintrusive, curated experience to teach you everything you need to know while allowing you to control your character the entire time. But once you leave the asylum, you are in the game. The world is yours to explore. There's no more tutorials, and your hand will never be held again. The game fully trusts you to learn as you go. But that really only works because of the first point we talked about, that the fundamental systems you learn at the beginning are the core of the game. You don't really need anything more than what you use to escape that first tutorial. So teach the player everything they need to know at the beginning, and then trust them to learn everything else throughout the rest of the game. There's nothing more immersion breaking in a Souls-like than a tutorial that feels like it never ends. And the final point I want to emphasize today is to not show all your cards at the beginning. Bloodborne has always been and will likely always be the best example of subverting expectations with a presentation and finale that the player could have never predicted. As we all know, the game starts out as a theme of monsters and werewolves, but by the end you're learning about all these eldritch gods and aliens. Lies of P did a pretty good job of this, as well as starting out as a game about puppets, but then introducing these corrupted monsters, an order of evil alchemists, and the mysteries of Ergo. Elden Ring did this in a number of different ways as well, besides a thematic change, where even though the nature of the world remained consistent throughout, every time you thought you had a grasp on how big it was, it would constantly unveil new areas to explore, new secrets to uncover, and it made your understanding feel smaller and smaller and smaller. Variety is the spice of life, and there's nothing more boring than a game that doesn't change from beginning to end. Although I loved my time playing Lords of the Fallen, one of the biggest negative points of that game was that you were fighting the same enemies from the first level all the way to the final level. There weren't really any big surprises. The world and character need to evolve as you progress through the game. Stakes need to become higher. The NPCs in the world need to understand that as well. Even if your Souls-like isn't a story game, this is what makes payoffs happen. All Souls-likes have a story. Whether it's at the forefront or not, the player should want to learn more about the world the game is set in. And FromSoftware are experts at this. None of their games are inherently story games, but they do an incredible job at making the world unfold around you, making you as the player feel as though you've evolved and left an impact on that world. And these are the kinds of things that make a game memorable. Oftentimes the core theme of a good Souls-like game is becoming stronger, and in order to actually grow, you cannot stay the same as you were at the beginning, and that goes for virtually every aspect of the game. But those are 5 things that I think are critical to making a good Souls-like game. Of course, there are many other things that go along with those, and the ones listed today are just my opinion. I'm no game dev, just a fan of the genre, and very enthusiastic to see it growing. But y'all let me know down in the comments section, do you agree with the things I've listed today, and what are some other suggestions you have? Of course, this video is not calling out any Souls-likes in particular, just speaking in broad terms. But with all that, if you enjoyed today's video, be sure to leave a like on it and subscribe if you're new around here. But with all that, I will catch you in the next one.